I never thought of myself as a lucky man, not in the way people usually mean it. I didn't win anything big, I didn't inherit anything, and I sure didn't marry into money. What I had was steadier than luck. I had a job that paid the bills, a house that didn't leak, a wife who still laughed at my bad jokes after 12 years, and a daughter who ran to the door every single day like I'd been gone a month instead of 8 hours. If you'd asked me back then what I was most proud of in my life, I wouldn't have said my work, even though I was good at it. I would have said my family. I would have said that no matter what else went sideways in the world, I had a home that made sense. I've been an electrician for going on 30 years now. There's something about that kind of work that changes how you see everything else. You learn to trust your hands. You learn to read a wall before you ever open it up, to know where the wiring runs just by the age of the house and the way the light switches are placed. You learn that most problems, even the dangerous ones, give you warning signs if you're paying attention. A flicker before a short, a smell before a fire. Flaky. I used to think that instinct only applied to houses. I found out later it applies to people too, except people are a lot better at hiding their warning signs than a bad circuit ever could be. That particular Tuesday started like most of my Tuesdays did. I was up before 6, coffee in hand, going over the day's job list at the kitchen table while Rachel got Lily ready for school. Lily was 8 that year, all elbows and energy, the kind of kid who talked with her whole body when she was excited about something. That morning, she was going on about a science project, some kind of volcano thing, and she wanted to know if I could help her build it that weekend. I told her I would, and she gave me this look like I'd just promised her the moon, which is one of the things I loved most about being her dad. It didn't take much to make her whole day. Rachel was quieter than usual that morning, but I didn't think much of it. She'd been quieter than usual for a few weeks by then, if I'm being honest with myself now looking back. She'd always been the kind of person who carried things well, who didn't make a show out of stress, so a little quiet from her never used to worry me. She'd tell me if something was wrong. That was the deal we'd made a long time ago, long before Lily was even born. We told each other the hard things first before anybody else, no matter how bad they were. I believed in that promise the way some men believe in their faith. I never thought I'd have a reason to doubt it. I noticed her checking her phone a couple of times that morning, quick glances, screen turned slightly away from me out of habit. More than anything, I assumed. I didn't think anything of it. We all check our phones too much these days. I remember making some comment about it, something light, asking if she was planning a surprise party I didn't know about. She laughed, but it came out a beat too late, a little thinner than her usual laugh. I filed it away without really filing it away, the way you do with 100 small things every day that don't seem worth holding on to. Work that day was supposed to run long. I had a rewiring job out past the county line, an older farmhouse with knob and tube wiring that the owner had been putting off dealing with for years. And jobs like that always take longer than anybody wants them to. I told Rachel I'd probably be home around 6, maybe later. She nodded, kissed me on the way out the door, same as always. Lily hollered goodbye from the bathroom. Something about not forgetting the volcano. It was an ordinary morning. I want to be clear about that because it matters. Nothing about that morning told me anything was wrong. If there were warning signs, and I know now that there were, I didn't see a single one of them. The job out at the farmhouse fell through around 1 in the afternoon. The homeowner's permit hadn't cleared yet, some paperwork mix-up with the county, and there was nothing for me to do but pack up and reschedule. I remember feeling a small flash of relief when that happened, the kind of relief you get from an unexpected free afternoon. I thought about calling Rachel to see if she wanted to do something as a family that evening, maybe get out of the house, maybe start that volcano project early since Lily would be thrilled. I decided to surprise her instead. I got back in my truck and I started driving home 3 hours earlier than anybody in my house was expecting me. I want you to understand something about that drive because I've thought about it 100 times since. I was in a good mood. I had the radio on. I was thinking about nothing more serious than baking soda and vinegar and whether we had enough of either one in the pantry. I had no idea that I was driving toward the worst afternoon of my life, and I had even less idea that the fear I was about to feel wouldn't only be about my daughter. Some of it, the part that would keep me up at night for weeks afterward, was going to be about my wife. The house looked completely normal from the driveway, which is a detail I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count. Rachel's car was there. The curtains were open the way they always were in the afternoon. There was no sign, no warning, nothing that told me to brace myself before I walked through that front door. I remember whistling as I climbed the porch steps, already picturing the look on Lily's face when she realized I was home early. I had my keys in one hand and my lunch cooler in the other, and I was thinking about baking soda volcanoes, not emergencies. The front door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual for the middle of the afternoon. I stepped inside, calling out that I was home, expecting to hear Lily's feet come pounding down the hallway the way they always did. Instead, I got silence. Not the comfortable kind of silence a quiet house sometimes has, but a wrong kind, a kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up before my mind had even caught up to why. I called out again, louder, and when nobody answered, I felt something shift low in my stomach, an instinct I didn't have a name for yet. I found her in the kitchen. Lily was on the floor near the table, completely still, her cereal bowl shattered beside her, like she'd gone down mid-bite, milk pooling out across the tile in a slow-spreading stain. I don't remember dropping my cooler, but I must have, because I found it later by the door, content spilled everywhere. I don't remember crossing the kitchen either. One second, I was standing in the doorway, and the next I was on my knees beside my daughter, saying her name, then saying it louder, saying it in a voice I didn't recognize as my own. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to find a pulse in her wrist. When I finally did, faint but there, something in my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe again, though it didn't come close to loosening all the way. She was breathing too shallow, but breathing. I kept saying her name, brushing her hair back from her face, telling her daddy was here, the way you talk to a child even when part of you knows she can't hear you yet. I had my phone out and I was already dialing before I'd fully decided to do it, some part of my brain still functioning enough to know what came next. It was only after the operator picked up, after I'd started answering her calm, steady questions about what happened and how old my daughter was, that I looked up and saw Rachel standing in the kitchen doorway. I want to describe this carefully because it's the part that stayed with me the longest, longer even than the fear for Lily, which doesn't make any sense on paper, but is the truth of how that day actually felt. Rachel wasn't crying. She wasn't moving toward us. She was standing very still, one hand pressed against the doorframe like she needed it to hold herself up, and the other hand wrapped around her phone so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Her face wasn't the face of a mother looking at her unconscious child. I've thought hard about how to explain the difference, because at the time I couldn't have put words to it. I only felt it, a wrongness underneath the moment that didn't match what was happening in front of us. She looked afraid, but it wasn't the kind of fear I would have expected. It was smaller somehow and more inward, like she was bracing for something that hadn't happened yet, rather than reacting to what already had. Her eyes kept dropping to the phone in her hand and then back up to me, quick, darting glances, and for one strange suspended second, it seemed like she was more worried about that phone than about our daughter lying on the floor between us. The 911 operator was still talking in my ear, telling me the ambulance was 4 minutes out, asking me to stay on the line. And I remember snapping at Rachel to come help me, to get a blanket, to do something, and she moved then, finally. But there was a half-second delay before she did, a hesitation I felt more than saw. She knelt down on Lily's other side and started saying her name too, and from the outside, I'm sure it looked like any 2 frightened parents doing exactly what they should be doing. But I was close enough to see her hands, and her hands weren't just shaking from fear. They were shaking like someone trying to hold 2 different kinds of panic at once, and only one of them belonged in that kitchen. I didn't have time to think about it. Not really. Lily needed me, and for the next few minutes, the entire world narrowed down to the sound of my daughter's shallow breathing and the sound of my own voice telling her to hang on. Help was coming. Daddy wasn't going anywhere. But some part of me, some small, cold, observing part that I didn't ask for and couldn't shut off, filed away what I'd seen on Rachel's face in that doorway. It sat there in the back of my mind like a splinter, small enough to ignore in the moment, but not small enough to disappear. The ambulance arrived in what felt like both 4 minutes and 4 hours. 2 paramedics came through the door with a speed and calm that steadied me just slightly, the kind of practiced competence that makes you feel, for the first time since you found your child on the floor, like maybe things are going to be handled by people who know what they're doing. The emergency room swallowed us into that particular kind of chaos that hospitals specialize in, controlled and urgent all at once. They took Lily back almost immediately, nurse rattling off questions to me as they wheeled her through a set of double doors that I wasn't allowed to follow through. I stood there for a second with my hands empty, not knowing what to do with them, before someone gently steered me toward a waiting area and told me a doctor would come find me. As soon as there was anything to report, Rachel arrived maybe 10 minutes after I did, slightly out of breath, her car keys still in her hand like she'd forgotten to put them away. I stood up when I saw her, and for a moment we just held on to each other in the middle of that waiting room. And I felt her shaking against me, and some of the coldness I'd been carrying since the kitchen eased off a little. Whatever else was going on, she was scared too. I told myself that mattered more than anything else I'd noticed. I told myself I was probably imagining most of it anyway. That fear does strange things to people's faces, that I had no business reading anything into a look I'd caught for half a second in a doorway. We sat together in those hard plastic chairs for almost an hour before anyone came to tell us anything. It was during that hour that I started noticing things again, small things, the kind I would have talked myself out of on any other day. Rachel's phone buzzed twice, and both times she excused herself to step just outside the waiting room doors to take the call, her voice dropping low enough that I couldn't make out the words through the glass. I asked her the first time who it was. She said it was her sister, checking in, wanting an update. That was reasonable. Rachel's sister lived 2 states away, and they talked often. Let it go. The second time, I didn't. I just watched her walk toward the doors with her shoulders drawn up tight around her ears, and I watched her turn her back to me once she was outside, angling herself so I couldn't see her face through the glass, even if I'd wanted to. I sat there in that chair with my daughter somewhere behind a set of doors I couldn't open, and I felt a strange, unfamiliar kind of loneliness, the kind that comes from realizing your partner is somewhere else entirely, even when she's standing 20 feet away. A doctor finally came out to update us, a younger woman with a calm, efficient way about her that I appreciated immediately. She told us Lily was stable, that her vitals had come back up and she was starting to regain consciousness, which was the first real relief I'd felt since I'd walked through my own front door. She said they wanted to run some additional tests, blood work mostly, to understand what had caused the episode and that it could take a few hours to get results. She asked us some routine questions then, the kind I imagine she asked every parent in a moment like this. Had Lily been sick recently? Had she eaten normally that morning? Had there been any changes in her routine, her sleep, her stress levels? Anything unusual at home, I answered honestly, because I didn't have any reason not to. Lily had seemed fine that morning, same as always, excited about her science project, eating her cereal, same as every other day. But when the doctor turned that same question toward Rachel, asking specifically about anything unusual at home lately, I noticed a pause before she answered. Not a long one, barely a beat. But I noticed it the same way you notice a light flicker that most people would miss entirely. Rachel said things had been normal, maybe a little busier than usual with work, but nothing out of the ordinary. She said it smoothly enough that the doctor didn't react to it at all, just nodded and made a note and moved on to her next question. But I was watching Rachel's hands while she said it, and they were doing that thing again. That same restless motion from the kitchen doorway, fingers pressing hard into the fabric of her jeans, like she was trying to keep something down. The doctor left us with instructions to wait, promising an update once the blood work came back. The two of us settled back into those uncomfortable chairs to do the hardest thing there is to do in a hospital, which is nothing at all except wait and imagine every possible outcome. I tried to make conversation a few times, small things, like asking if she wanted coffee, telling her Lily was going to be fine, that kids' bodies are more resilient than we give them credit for. Rachel answered in short sentences, polite but distant, her eyes drifting toward the doors every few minutes, toward her phone every few minutes, and only occasionally toward me. I asked her once, quietly, if there was something she wanted to tell me. I tried to keep my voice gentle, the way I would have asked her anything in the 12 years we'd been married, no accusation in it. Just an open door for her to walk through if she needed to. She looked at me for a second, and there was something in her face right then that I almost couldn't read. Something caught between wanting to answer and wanting to run. Then she shook her head, said she was just scared about Lily, same as me, and reached over to take my hand. I let her. I told myself that was answer enough. I told myself a lot of things that day that I'd later have to unlearn one at a time. By the time the doctor came back with results, it was well past dark outside the waiting room windows. Lily's blood work had come back mostly normal, she said, though there were a couple of markers worth keeping an eye on, nothing alarming on its own, but enough that she wanted us to follow up with our regular pediatrician within the week for more thorough testing. For now, she said, Lily could go home, rest, eat normally, and be watched closely for the next few days. It wasn't the clean, simple answer I'd been hoping for, the kind that closes a door completely. It was the kind of we got Lily settled into bed that night with more fuss than usual. Extra pillows, the hallway light left on. A promise from both of us that we'd check on her every hour if she needed us to. She fell asleep faster than I expected, worn out in the particular way only a scared, exhausted child can be. And I stood in her doorway longer than necessary, just watching her chest rise and fall, making sure of it with my own eyes, even though the doctors had already made sure of it with machines. Rachel and I didn't talk much once we came back downstairs. We moved around each other in the kitchen, doing small, quiet tasks, cleaning up what was left of that morning's mess, the shattered bowl still swept into a pile by the trash can where I'd left it hours earlier without the stomach to deal with it properly. Neither of us mentioned what had happened in that hospital waiting room, the pauses, the phone calls, the questions she'd answered a beat too carefully. I didn't have the energy for it that night, and I don't think she did either. So instead, I found myself thinking back, unprompted, to a night almost 10 years earlier, back, when Rachel and I were still newly married and still learning the shape of each other. We'd been married about 2 years at that point, renting a small apartment above a hardware store downtown, both of us working jobs that didn't pay much, but felt like the beginning of something. Rachel had been going through a rough stretch with her family back then, her father's business failing, her parents leaning on her, more than was fair for a daughter still finding her own footing. She'd been keeping it from me for weeks, not out of malice, but because she didn't want to add weight to what she saw as my own struggles, since I'd just started my apprenticeship and money was tight for both of us. I found out anyway, the way you eventually find out most things when you live with someone and pay attention. I noticed she'd stopped sleeping, noticed the way she flinched a little every time her phone rang, noticed she'd started keeping the mail in a drawer instead of on the counter where we usually left it. When I finally sat her down and asked her directly what was going on, she broke down in a way I hadn't seen from her before. All at once, like something she'd been holding shut with both hands had finally given out. I remember exactly where we were sitting, on the floor of that apartment, because we didn't yet own a couch worth sitting on, our backs against the second-hand love seat we'd bought off a coworker of mine. She told me everything that night, her father's business, the loans, the strain it had put on her parents' marriage, the guilt she carried for not being able to fix any of it. I didn't have solutions for her. I was 26 years old and barely keeping my own head above water. But I remember telling her that whatever was wrong, whatever came at us, I needed her to bring it to me first. Before she carried it alone, before she let it eat at her in silence the way I could tell it already had been, she'd ask me why that mattered so much to me, and I told her about my own childhood, something I hadn't talked about much before that night. I grew up in a house where problems got hidden instead of handled, where my parents fought in whispers behind closed doors and pretended everything was fine at the dinner table, where I learned as a kid to read the tension in a room without anyone ever having to say a word about what was actually wrong. I told her I never wanted that for us, that I'd rather deal with something hard together than live inside a house, full of things nobody was allowed to say out loud. Rachel had cried harder after that, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that comes from relief instead of fear. She promised me that night, and I promised her right back, that whatever came at us, good or bad, we'd tell each other first. Not our friends first, not our families first. Each other first, even when it was hard, even when it was embarrassing, even when some part of us wanted to protect the other person from the weight of it. We shook on it like a couple of kids making a pact, which in a lot of ways is exactly what we were like. And then we sat there a while longer, just holding on to each other on that hardwood floor, feeling like we'd built something that would hold. For years, that promise held up exactly the way we'd hoped it would. When my apprenticeship almost fell through, in our 3rd year of marriage, I told her before I told anybody else, even before I fully processed it myself. When Rachel's mother got sick a few years after that, she came to me first, before her sister, before her friends. And we sat up most of one night, making a plan together for how she'd manage the caretaking without losing herself in it. It became a kind of shorthand between us, a phrase we'd say to each other during hard stretches. Tell me first. It meant something. It had always meant something. Standing in our kitchen that night after the hospital, drying dishes that didn't really need drying just to have something to do with my hands, I found myself turning that old promise over in my mind and measuring it against what I'd seen in Rachel's face earlier that day. The woman on the floor of that apartment 10 years ago had come to me the second she couldn't carry something alone anymore. The woman standing across the kitchen from me now, rinsing the same mug for the third time, hadn't come to me at all. Whatever she was carrying, I was starting to understand that she'd been carrying it by herself for a while, and that the promised morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of light that makes a house feel like it's holding its breath. Lily was still asleep when I got up, and I stood in her doorway again out of habit more than necessity, watching her for a few seconds before I made my way downstairs. Rachel was already in the kitchen, coffee made, standing at the counter with her back to me, and something about the set of her shoulders told me she'd been up longer than I had, maybe longer than she'd slept at all. I didn't ease into it. I'd promised myself the night before that I wasn't going to let the moment slip past me again. Wasn't going to let her wave me off with a half answer and a change of subject the way she had in the hospital. So I poured myself a cup of coffee, stood across the counter from her, and asked her straight out what was going on. I told her I'd seen her face in that kitchen doorway, that I'd seen it again in the waiting room, and that whatever it was, I needed her to tell me. I reminded her gently of our promise. Lee, tell me first. She didn't answer right away. She wrapped both hands around her mug like she was trying to warm them even though the kitchen wasn't cold, and she stared down into the coffee instead of looking at me. I watched something move across her face, something that looked almost like relief for half a second, like she was about to let go of whatever she'd been holding on to. Then it closed back up again, quick, like a door pulled shut from the inside. She said it was nothing, that she'd just been scared out of her mind seeing Lily on that floor, that she probably looked strange because fear does strange things to people. She said she was sorry if she'd worried me on top of everything else. I wanted to believe her. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy now, knowing everything I know, to make myself sound sharper than I actually was that morning. Part of me wanted badly to accept what she was telling me and let the whole thing drop, to chalk it up to shock and move on with our lives. But another part of me, the part that had spent 30 years learning to trust what my gut told me, even when my eyes couldn't fully explain it, wasn't buying it. I told her that. I told her. I didn't think fear alone explained the phone calls, or the way she kept stepping outside to take them, or the pause before she answered the doctor's questions. That's when the conversation stopped being gentle, like a. She set her mug down harder than she needed to and asked me if I was accusing her of something, her voice sharper than I'd heard it in a long time. I said I wasn't accusing her of anything, I was asking her, which wasn't the same thing, lied. But she wasn't in a place to hear the difference. She said I had no idea what the last few weeks had been like for her, and then almost as fast as she'd said it, she looked like she wished she could take it back. I asked her what that meant, like, what the last few weeks had actually been like. And for a second, I thought she was finally going to tell me. Instead, she shook her head and said she couldn't do this right now, not with Lily upstairs, not after the day we'd just had. She said we'd talk about it later. Why? Once things had settled down, and there was something so final in the way she said it that I knew pushing any harder in that moment wasn't going to get me anywhere. I felt something in my chest go tight and cold, a feeling I wasn't used to having toward my own wife. 12 years, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt like a stranger standing in my own kitchen. But that's exactly what I felt like watching her walk past me toward the stairs, phone already back in her hand before she'd even left the room. I stood there by myself for a long minute after she'd gone, turning the last few minutes over in my head. She'd said I had no idea what the last few weeks had been like for her. That was nothing. That was the closest thing to an admission I'd gotten out of her since the ambulance had pulled out of our driveway. And it told me two things I didn't want to know. It told me something really had been going on, something bigger than an ordinary bad week. It told me she wasn't ready to let me in on it, not yet, maybe not on her own at all. I went to work that day because there wasn't much else to do, because Lily needed to feel like things were getting back to normal, and because I genuinely didn't know what else to do with myself. But I wasn't really present for any of it. I kept replaying that conversation in the kitchen, kept hearing the sharpness in her voice, kept picturing the way her hand had gone straight to her phone the second the conversation got difficult. By the time I got home that evening, I'd made a decision I wasn't entirely proud of, but one I couldn't talk myself out of either. If Rachel wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I was going to find out on my own. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because it matters to how the rest of this unfolded. I'd never gone looking through my wife's things before. Not once in 12 years of marriage. It wasn't a line I ever thought I'd cross. And some part of me hated myself even as I did it. Some part of me kept saying, "This isn't who you are, Daniel. Put it back. Ask her again instead." But another part of me, the part that had watched my daughter carried out of our kitchen on a stretcher 2 days earlier, wasn't willing to keep waiting on an answer that might never come on its own. It was a Thursday evening. Rachel had taken Lily to a follow-up appointment with our pediatrician, the one the hospital had recommended, and I'd stayed behind under the excuse of finishing some paperwork for a job. The house was quiet in that particular way it gets when you know you're the only one in it, and I stood in our bedroom for a long moment before I let myself do what I'd been thinking about doing all day. I started in the hall closet, the one where we kept old files and tax documents, not really knowing what I was looking for, only knowing that something in this house didn't add up. It took me longer than I expected, going through folders of old insurance papers and warranty booklets, before I found it tucked behind a shoebox on the top shelf where it clearly wasn't meant to be found by accident. A manila envelope, unmarked, heavier than it should have been, for what I assumed was just paper. I sat down on the edge of our bed and opened it, and what I found inside made my stomach drop in a way I hadn't felt since that afternoon in the kitchen. Bank statements, several months' worth, showing transfers I didn't recognize, money moving out of an account I didn't even know Rachel had, thousands of dollars over the course of what looked like almost half a year. There were text message printouts too, conversations between Rachel and a number, saved only as initials. Nothing romantic in the words themselves as far as I could tell, but urgent, tense, full of phrases like, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, and please don't tell him yet." I sat there on that bed for a long time with those papers in my lap, and I felt something in me go cold and hard in a way I didn't recognize. My mind went where I imagined most minds would go in that situation. An affair, a gambling problem. Some secret life I'd had no idea was running parallel to the one I thought we were living together. I thought about the flinch in her shoulders every time her phone rang. I thought about the way she'd stepped outside the waiting room to take those calls, angling her back to me through the glass. I thought about, "Please don't tell him yet," and I felt something close to grief settle over me. The specific kind that comes from realizing the ground you've been standing on for 12 years might not be as solid as you believed. I heard the garage door open around 6, heard Lily's voice calling out something about the doctor giving her a sticker, and I had maybe 30 seconds to decide what I was going to do with what I'd just found. I put the envelope down on the kitchen table instead of putting it back where I'd found it, because some part of me had already decided I wasn't going to pretend I hadn't seen it. I told Lily to go wash up for dinner, kept my voice as steady as I could manage for her sake, and waited until she was upstairs before I turned to face Rachel in the kitchen. She saw the envelope on the table before she saw my face, and I watched all the color drain out of hers in an instant. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. She just stood there in the doorway, coat still half on, looking at that envelope like it was a live wire I'd left lying across our kitchen floor. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, which wasn't very calm at all, who she'd been sending money to, and why and what exactly I wasn't supposed to be told yet. My voice cracked a little on that last part, more than I wanted it to. I told her I'd seen the texts. I told her I didn't know what to think anymore, and that not knowing was worse than almost anything she could tell me, so she needed to just tell me right now whatever it was. For a moment she didn't say anything at all. She set her bag down slowly on the counter, and I watched her hands shake, the same way they'd shaken in that kitchen doorway. 2 days earlier, that same restless, contained panic I hadn't been able to name at the time. Her eyes went wet, but she didn't cry, not yet. She just stood there looking at me like she was standing at the edge of something she'd been trying not to fall into for months. Then she said my name, quiet, almost like an apology all on its own, and told me it wasn't what I thought it was. I told her I didn't know what to think, because she hadn't given me anything to think with, only silence and half answers and a locked phone and an envelope hidden behind a shoebox in our closet. She flinched at that, and for a second I thought she might shut down again the way she had ever since their father passed away and left her, as the oldest, feeling like the one who had to hold things together. I'd known Mark was struggling in a general sense. What I hadn't known was how badly, or how long Rachel had been quietly trying to fix it on her own. It had started small, she told me, back in the early spring. Mark had lost his job and fallen behind on rent, and he'd called Rachel first, not their mother, not anyone else, because he was too ashamed to let the rest of the family know how bad things had gotten. She'd sent him money to cover it, a few $100s, telling herself it was a one-time thing, the kind of help any sister would give. But it hadn't been one time. Within a month, he'd needed more, and the month after that, more again, and somewhere along the way, what had started as helping her brother through a rough patch had turned into Rachel quietly propping up his entire life, month after month, without either of us ever discussing it, because she'd never told me it was happening at all. I asked her, and I tried to keep the hurt out of my voice, even though I knew it was there anyway, why she hadn't come to me. We had that promise. We'd had it for 10 years. She looked down at her hands on the table and told me it started small enough that it hadn't felt like something worth bringing to me, and by the time it had grown into something bigger, she'd already been keeping it from me long enough that telling me felt impossible, because then she'd have to explain not just the money, but the months of silence around it too. She said she felt ashamed, not of helping her brother, but of how deep she'd let herself get pulled in without ever putting a stop to it, and ashamed of breaking the one promise she'd always been so sure she'd never break. She told me about the calls, the ones I'd noticed in the hospital, the ones that had sent her stepping outside with her back turned. Mark had been spiraling worse over the last few weeks, not just financially, but in other ways too, drinking more than he should have been, calling her at strange hours, upset and sometimes not making full sense, and she'd been trying to manage all of it alone, terrified that if she told anyone, even me, it would somehow make it more real, or worse, make me see her as someone who'd let a problem grow this big right under my nose without saying a word. I asked her, because I had to, whether any of this had anything to do with what happened to Lily. I watched her flinch at the question, watched real pain move across her face, and she told me she'd asked herself the same thing over and over since that afternoon, replaying every moment of the weeks before, wondering if her distraction, her late nights on the phone, her mind constantly somewhere else had somehow caused what happened to our daughter. She said she didn't know for certain, but she was terrified that it had, and that fear, more than anything else, was what I'd seen frozen on her face in that kitchen doorway. Not guilt over some affair. Guilt over the possibility that her silence, her secret keeping, had cost our daughter something none of us could take back. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the anger I'd been carrying for 2 days shift into something more complicated, something that still had hurt in it, but wasn't only hurt anymore. I told her I needed a minute, and I got up and walked to the sink and stood there with my hands braced against the counter, not running the water, just needing something solid to hold on to, while my mind worked through everything she'd just told me. Behind me, I could hear her crying quietly at the table, the sound small and exhausted, like it had been held back for a very long time and had finally found a way out. That's when my phone rang. It was our pediatrician's office, the number I recognized immediately from the appointment card still stuck to our fridge, and something in my chest tightened all over again as I answered it, because I realized in that instant that we hadn't yet gotten the full results from Lily's follow-up blood work, and Rachel had taken her in that very afternoon for exactly that reason. I put the phone on speaker without thinking, some instinct telling me Rachel needed to hear this as much as I did, and the nurse. We were at the pediatrician's office before it even opened the next morning, sitting in the parking lot in silence, because we'd both woken up too anxious to stay in the house any longer. Rachel hadn't slept much, I could tell, and neither had I. Whatever distance had opened up between us over the last few days seemed to shrink a little in that parking lot, both of us united for the moment by the same fear, waiting for the same door to unlock. Dr. Coleman had been Lily's pediatrician since she was a baby, a calm, steady woman in her 50s, who had a way of delivering information that never felt rushed, even when I'm sure her schedule was as packed as any doctor's. She brought us back to her office instead of an exam room, which told me before she said a single word that, whatever this was, it wasn't going to be a 2-minute conversation. Lily was with us too, sitting quietly in the chair between Rachel and me, swinging her feet and looking between the three of us adults, like she could tell something serious was happening, even if she didn't understand what. Dr. Coleman started by telling us Lily was going to be fine, which was the first thing I needed to hear, and the only thing that let me actually listen to everything that came after it. She explained that Lily's blood work had shown signs of a blood sugar irregularity, something that had likely been building for a while without any obvious symptoms, the kind of thing that can occur in growing kids and often goes unnoticed until something triggers an episode like the one Lily had experienced in our kitchen. She said it wasn't caused by anything either of us had done or failed to do, that these things can develop quietly, but that Lily's morning routine, particularly what and when she was eating, likely played a role in that specific afternoon. I felt Rachel go very still beside me. Dr. Coleman continued gently, explaining that Lily's blood sugar had likely dropped sharply that morning, possibly because breakfast had been rushed or skipped in part, combined with a growth spurt and an unusually active week at school, all of it converging into the kind of episode that had landed her on our kitchen floor. She said it wasn't dangerous long term, that with some dietary adjustments and a follow-up plan, Lily would be perfectly fine, but that it was worth understanding the whole picture, including the household routine leading up to it, so it wouldn't happen again. I didn't need to look at Rachel to know what she was thinking, because I was thinking it too. Breakfast had been rushed that week. More than rushed, some mornings if I was being honest with myself now, remembering back. Rachel had been distracted, up late on calls with her brother, up early worrying about money she was quietly moving around without telling me, and somewhere in the middle of carrying that weight alone. Small things like making sure Lily ate a full breakfast before school had slipped through the cracks in ways neither of us had noticed until it mattered. I want to be clear about something, because it would be easy to make this sound like it was Rachel's fault, like her secret had directly caused what happened to our daughter. That's not what Dr. Coleman said, and it's not the truth of it either. Kids' bodies do unpredictable things. Growth spurts and irregular eating and stress all tangle together in ways no parent can fully control or predict. But it wasn't nothing either. The weeks Rachel had spent distracted, exhausted, and quietly unraveling under a weight she wouldn't let me help carry had created a house that was just slightly less steady than it used to be. And Lily, without ever knowing why, had felt that unsteadiness too, in small ways that added up. Dr. Coleman gave us a plan, dietary changes, a follow-up appointment in a month, some guidance on keeping Lily's routine more consistent, and she said all of it with the kind of practical, reassuring confidence that made the whole thing feel manageable instead of frightening. Lily, for her part, mostly wanted to know if this meant she got to eat more snacks, which pulled the first real laugh out of both Rachel and me since the whole ordeal had started, a small, cracked laugh, but a real one. We thanked Dr. Coleman and walked back out to the car, Lily chattering about snack options the entire way, blissfully unaware. That night, after Lily had gone to bed full of extra crackers and reassurances that snacks were in fact still allowed, Rachel and I sat down at the kitchen table together, the same table where that manila envelope had sat 2 nights earlier, the same table where our marriage had cracked open in a way I don't think either of us saw coming. When we woke up that Tuesday morning nearly a week before, I told her what I'd been sitting with since we left Dr. Coleman's office, which was a kind of grief I hadn't expected to feel. Not grief over losing her, not exactly, but grief over the version of our marriage I'd believed in so completely, the one where nothing serious ever went unspoken between us. I told her that finding out about Mark, about the money, about the months of secrecy, hadn't just hurt because of what she'd hidden. It had hurt because it meant the promise we made on that apartment floor 10 years ago, the one I'd built so much of my own sense of safety around, hadn't held the way I thought it had. Rachel didn't try to defend herself the way she had in that first conversation in the kitchen. She just listened, really listened, in a way she hadn't let herself do while she was still trying to keep the walls up, around what she'd been hiding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee mug slowly in her hands. And then she told me something that shifted the whole shape of what I'd been feeling. She said she hadn't broken that promise because she stopped believing in it. She'd broken it because she was afraid of what it would mean if she kept it. She was afraid that if she told me how deep she'd let herself get pulled into fixing Mark's life, I'd think less of her, or worse, that I'd think she'd failed at the one thing she'd always prided herself on, which was holding her family together without letting anyone fall through the cracks. She said the longer she kept it from me, the more impossible it felt to bring it up, because then she'd have to admit not just the problem itself, but months of having hidden it, and that felt like a betrayal so much bigger than the original secret that she just kept pushing it further down instead. I understood that in a way I hadn't expected to. I thought about my own childhood again, the house where problems got hidden instead of spoken, and I realized, sitting there across from her, that I'd spent 12 years so afraid of recreating that kind of house that I'd never once considered what it might look like from the other side, what it might feel like to be the one carrying something you were terrified to say out loud, even to the person who loved you most. I told her that. I told her I understood the fear now, even if I still wished with everything in me that she'd trusted me enough to let me carry some of that weight alongside her instead of alone. She reached across the table and took my hand, and I let her, the same way I had in that hospital waiting room days earlier, except this time it felt different. This time it felt earned instead of just offered. She told me she wanted to call Mark together, the two of us, to have an honest conversation about what kind of help was actually sustainable, what she could keep giving without it quietly hollowing her out the way it had, and what boundaries needed to exist so that helping him didn't come at the cost of our own family again. She said she didn't want to do it alone anymore, not because she couldn't, but because our marriage was supposed to mean she didn't have to. We sat at that table a long time that night, longer than either of us probably needed to, talking through everything, not just about Mark, but about the promise itself, what it had meant to us at 26, and what it needed to mean now, 12 years and one very frightening week later. We agreed that the promise wasn't broken beyond repair. It had just been tested in a way we hadn't expected, and it had shown us both a blind spot we hadn't known was there. Me, in how quick I'd been to assume the worst the moment I found something I didn't understand. Her, in how easily fear could talk her out of the one thing she'd always sworn she'd never let happen in our house. Before we went up to bed, Rachel said something I've thought about often since. She said she didn't think either of us had failed the promise so much as 2 months passed before I really felt like our house had settled back into itself. Though settled isn't quite the right word, because what we found on the other side of that week wasn't the same as what we'd had before it. It was steadier in some ways I hadn't expected, and more honest in ways that took real effort to maintain, the kind of effort you don't think about when things are easy, but that becomes a daily choice once you've seen firsthand what happens when honesty slips. Rachel and I called Mark together, just like she said we would. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it wasn't a one-time fix either. We helped him find a counselor, helped him put together an actual plan instead of a series of emergency phone calls, and we set boundaries around what kind of help Rachel could keep giving, without it costing our own family the way it almost had. Mark struggled with some of it at first, the way people do when a pattern that's worked for them, even a damaging one, starts to change. But slowly, over those 2 months, things between him and Rachel found a footing that felt more like support than rescue, which made all the difference. Lily's checkups came back steady too. We adjusted her mornings, made sure breakfast wasn't something rushed or skipped, built in a little more consistency to school, nights, and screen time and sleep, the kind of small structural changes that don't look like much on their own, but add up to a child feeling steadier in her own body. She still talked about that volcano project constantly, and we finally built it together one Saturday afternoon. The three of us crowded around the kitchen table with baking soda and food coloring and far too much vinegar, laughing every time it erupted, Lily shrieking with delight, like it was the greatest scientific achievement in human history. That kitchen, the same one where I'd found her unconscious on the floor 2 months earlier, the same one where the envelope had sat open between Rachel and me while our marriage cracked and then slowly began to mend, became something different by the end of that summer. It stopped being the place where the worst afternoon of my life happened and went back to being what it always used to be, the room where our family actually lived, arguments and homework and burnt toast and volcano explosions and all. I think about that Tuesday often, more often than I expected to this far removed from it. I think about walking through that front door with baking soda volcanoes on my mind, having no idea I was about to walk into the hardest week of my marriage. I think about the version of myself who found that envelope and jumped straight to the worst possible conclusion. And I try to hold on to some grace for that version of me. Because fear does that to people. It fills in blanks with whatever feels most immediate and most frightening, and it takes real effort to slow down long enough to ask instead of assume. But mostly I think about Rachel, standing in that kitchen doorway that first afternoon, carrying something so heavy, she didn't know how to put it down, not because she didn't trust me, but because she was scared of what trusting me might cost her. I understand now that the fear I saw on her face wasn't the fear of a woman who'd done something wrong to our daughter. It was the fear of a woman who'd been quietly drowning under the weight of loving her brother and loving her family at the same time, and hadn't yet learned that those two things didn't have to live in separate secret rooms. We didn't come out the other side of that week because one of us was right and the other was wrong. We came out of it because we were both willing to look honestly at the parts of ourselves that had let things get that bad in the first place. Her fear of being seen as failing, mine of assuming the worst instead of asking the hardest questions directly. We're better at the promise now than we were before, not because we're perfect at it, but because we know now what it actually costs to keep. And we've decided deliberately, over and over, that it's worth paying. Some evenings now, I'll come home from work and find Rachel and Lily in the kitchen together, flour on the counter or homework spread across the table. Ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way I used to take for granted before that Tuesday. I don't take it for granted anymore. I stand in the doorway sometimes, just for a second. The same doorway where I once saw fear on my wife's face that I couldn't understand, and now